Hi folks, and welcome to this little bonus video where I'm going to talk about a role-playing game called Run from the Dark, which is described as a folk horror role-playing game, and they are actually going live on Kickstarter today. Now, this is a sponsored review. They did ask me to take a look at this, but I actually think this book is really cool. I really like some stuff I'm seeing here, and I think you would benefit from hearing about it. This is something that I would happily talk about, even if I wasn't being sponsored to do so. The sponsorship just helps me justify putting it on the schedule and making a little bonus video about it today. But I think this is a really neat product, and I want to share it with you. So I'm going to take you through this book and just share the things that I think make this really cool or interesting. Talk about other games that it's similar to and what I think makes it different from those. And that can kind of help inform whether or not you're interested in this. And if you are, there is a link in the description to check it out. Now, one thing that's really interesting right off the bat is that Run from the Dark is not a sort of generic medieval fantasy world that I think a lot of us are used to seeing in so many other role-playing games and media. This is not Westeros. This is not the Forgotten Realms. As we can see from things like, we have names like Fort Granville, but then we have another translation of it, Caer Granville. We have Coed Synthwraith, but it's also the Synthwraith Woods. So we have a translation that is going to be easier for us to discuss, like the Pale Woods, King's Skull, Spirit Woods, Bloodwood, Undercrag, Dead Hands Forest. But we also have the sort of localization names like Dan Glogurg. Now, if you're already familiar with the real world language and culture that was a major influence on this fantasy world, which this is inspired by Welsh, you're probably grimacing at my pronunciation, and that's completely fair and valid. And, you know, if you just want to use the terms, the Ragged Rocks, the Everburn Forest, the Dead Oak Forest, the Wetlands, Giant Hill, the Flesh Woods, these are all still perfectly evocative on their own. The Hollow Lands, like, yeah, those absolutely still just work as names. The Glow, Underhill, Corpse Woods, the Burn, Head of Valley. There's still some really good and inviting and evocative things here. The Dark's Woods, will talk more about why dark is a possessive on the next page. But what I think this really speaks to is the fact that we do have another name for each of these places that is the local name. It's the language that our characters are presumably actually speaking. But this already really changes the tone of the world and the tone of the fantasy being shared by the game. Now, the world of the game has something called the Dark, and the Dark is a little bit like the Umbra in Age of Umbra, right? This is not just the darkness. It's not just shadow or nighttime. It is a force. It is some sort of entity. But the trouble that I had when I was reading the Age of Umbra setting for Daggerheart is that I didn't really know what to do with the Dark. And here, there is quite a lot more given to sort of expand upon how we're going to use the Dark in our games, more so than I felt like I got from reading about the Umbra in Age of Umbra. So first of all, if we go back to just looking at the world itself, it's set in a fictional world where technology from a forgotten time before the Dark is indistinguishable from the magic of hedge witches and those corrupted by the Dark. So once again, Dark can corrupt people. We'll talk about that more in a second. The Dark is not gloom or darkness. Dark flees from the light, but it is not an absence of light. It is something that consumes and corrupts. It is described as a wall of jet black darkness that you cannot see beyond. Your light simply ends where the Dark begins. And they really describe how the people in this world work during the summer, and then in the winter, the Dark sort of spreads forth and overtakes the world, and people really have to shelter in their communities in more along the lines of something like Age of Umbra. And again, we'll discuss more on that in a second, but I'm actually just going to read this section because I think it says it really well. In Run from the Dark, you play as the Walkers, light carriers, those who carry the sun, those who go out into the dark, those who travel between towns and take their light with them, those who connect towns during the grueling months of winter, when the sun abandons the people, crunching frozen ground underfoot as you make your way forward. You are the explorers of forests, caves, and the only ones brave enough to seek out what lives in the dark. And then I love it when a game just tells you what it's about, like what themes it wants to explore. No notes. This is exactly what they do here. Run from the Dark is about our pasts and our futures. Humanity is facing its greatest ever threat, and so Run from the Dark deals with themes of violence, horror, existential crisis, civilization collapse, and death. It does not include themes of sexual violence, racism, transphobia, or any other bigotry. If something in Run from the Dark upsets you or your players, please leave it out, modify it, or play another game. This is a game and it is meant to be an enjoyable experience. If there is something in the game you don't like, a theme, a rule, or anything else, change it. This is your game too. Could you imagine people getting really upset by a game telling you, this is your game, this is, one might dare to say, your story, and getting really bent out of shape about that when, like, yes, of course, this is what all games are. All these games that we play are ours to play with and tell the stories we want to. They don't include any themes of sexual violence, racism, transphobia, or anything else like that. And if you want to do that, they don't feel like this game is the right fit for them. But also, specifically, they're dealing with very dark themes. They're dealing with themes of climate change, essentially, and this sort of imminent threat we all feel at civilization's collapse, as they literally say here. And I think that's something that a lot of us can really relate to. And I think they also, this really appeals to me as a game that is about isolation. And I think that we are all feeling a really pronounced sense of isolation these days for lots of different reasons, through technology in a lot of our cases, or class isolation, or political, obviously. And so for a game to say, okay, and this is the thing that I really like that role-playing games do, and I've talked about this before lots of times, where they don't offer you just a way to escape that by bringing us together at a table, which is obviously a way to combat isolation. But they also, with games like this, give you the opportunity to just sit down at a table and gamify those feelings, those sentiments, those things that we are struggling with. But Run from the Dark is really cooking on my level, where they're literally saying, okay, we feel, and we think a lot of you feel the same way, isolation and anxiety about the state of the world and the shape of things to come, and the sort of dangers left over from the past that are lurking out there to get us, and we don't feel like anyone is coming to help us with this. We keep looking for authorities, and there are none. You know, there is no centralized government to speak of in this description of the world of Run from the Dark. It really is each town, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, each town is living their own lives and finding their own way to get through the problems. And we, as players, as the walkers in Run from the Dark, the people who are actually going out in between these towns, we're connecting different cultures together. We're conveying, you know, through sort of oral storytelling and just sort of spreading the word and sharing news. We are trying to maintain and cultivate the connections between people who are otherwise encouraged by their circumstances to feel isolated and alienated from each other. And that is such a theme that I am really ready to explore in a tabletop game. You know, I think this game really speaks to what I think a lot of us went through after COVID, which is, even if we were lucky enough to not have any loved ones lost to the disease, which I was lucky enough to not have to have anyone in my life pass away from COVID, I still had friendships with her. You know, that isolation that I think we all felt. I mean, I know we all felt, unless we were doing things we shouldn't have been doing. When everyone was sort of isolated into their own pods, even when we were trying to communicate virtually with each other, it was still so limiting, and we felt all these sort of communities decay and decline. And I just gave a thumbs up somehow. I guess that shows up on the camera too. So to me, this game really does feel like it is designed for the moment we are in right now. You know, having come off of COVID and recent electoral politics, certainly in my little corner of the world in America, possibly where you are as well, because there do seem to be some trends happening out there. And social media, and I hate to be, you know, the guy who's beating that drum again, but because we all know. But yeah, social media is a part of it too, where I think we all feel think connected and yet still isolated because of the way that it sort of flattens discourse and nuance. And, this is very clearly a heavy game. This is not escapism. I think when you sit down with a game like this, you're not looking for escapism. This isn't just we're going to go kill some monsters. This is we are going to sit down with something that's going to make us feel a little tense in more than just one way. Yes, there's obviously the darkness and the monsters. All of that stuff is very intense. It should be at the table. So already just through the nature of this game, you should have some intensity. You should have some anxiety at the table because it should be a stressful situation. And you hope that you'll be able to replicate that for the players in a fun way, the way you might with a roller coaster or a dark ride or something like that, or a haunted house. But I think there's also a cathartic aspect to games like this, and that is the kind of stuff I really, really like. If you are like me, and I think some of you are, and you like it when your games are about, not to say that you don't enjoy the hacking and the slashing and the fighting and the things like that, but if you also really like it when your game is about a little bit more than that, I think you would like Run from the Dark. And we'll talk more about mechanics as well, because that's a part of this conversation too. But I would encourage you to check out this game. If you like it when games are a little bit more weighty and are really about something. And we're gonna see how it sort of talks more about this in a second, because what coming to the dark section. So this really talks about how the dark is. I mean, they literally say right at the beginning, you don't know what it is, even as the Watcher. That's the name of the people who run the game. They were called the Watchers. Even as the Watcher, they don't tell you what the dark is. I have ideas, but you can kind of decide for yourself. It's suggested it could be, as they say at the beginning, an entity or a force of nature, a curse, or a being from the other world, an angered god, a fiend. You don't know. You may never know. But what we do know is that different people have different ways to keep the dark at bay. Now, I'm going to bring back the comparison to Age of Umbra. In Age of Umbra, there's something called the Blessed Branches. You need a Blessed Branch to keep the Umbra at bay. Here, you just need light of some kind, but, and this is the thing I really, really like, to keep the dark at bay, each town employs their own method to keep the light. From burning bonfires to algae lanterns, each town keeps its torches and candles lit during the winter months. I really like that it is basically encouraging you to make your own community, your own settlement that has their own approach to keeping the darkness at bay. There's more here talking about how the dark corrupts people who get too close to it, and how you can draw magic from it, but that's not always the best suggestion. People who can become corrupted by the dark walk into it and are never seen again. Making sure that you know that it's different from just darkness, that this is a literal malevolent entity of some kind, which is an important distinction. And I think I like the way they personify this a little bit more than the way they do with the Umbra in Age of Umbra, where they literally describe it as like a storm that's sort of unpredictable, which is fine and fair, and they're doing their own thing, which is totally cool. I like that this is they literally describe it as a single entity that spreads across many regions and is even able to persist when cut off with other aspects of the dark. It has been known for the dark to get into mines and houses and exist there. So again, the idea that it can enter indoor spaces and linger, really interesting, and I'm already thinking of ways that I can kind of incorporate that into a game. Now, this is not a Game of Thrones world where the seasons are years long, but they are a little bit unpredictable. They're not always the same length. So they talk about here how a summer might last 6 months or 6 weeks, and hedge witches specifically are valued because they know when the dark is going to return. But once winter ends, the dark retreats. It goes back into the large forests, the deep caves, the places, the mines that we talked about earlier, and then summer and spring last for several months on average, which gives people a chance to prepare for the dark. Winter is the big feeling of dread, and so I like that in these other seasons they're sort of defined by their absence of darkness. Spring here is described as the dark retreats, the nights draw shorter. During spring, being out at night is still dangerous, because even though the dark has retreated, there were still monsters that came out in the darkness, like the movie Pitch Black, where it's not just the darkness that's danger, but as the darkness is out there, monsters are also just running around. So even though the dark retreats in springtime, there are still other monsters and horrors that are still loose. So you're not totally safe in spring. Summer is the safest period. And we'll talk more about how you can still have adventures set in summer when we get to the next section. Now, autumn is when, as the nights get longer, people start to get more and more worried about the dark, which really does come down to that idea of like, can you get the harvest done in time to be ready for winter, right? What I really like here is that there's also this basically inciting incident that begins the transition. During autumn, the night of the blood moon occurs, and the blood moons come forth to spread misery. With the streets crimson with the work of the little fae, winter is not far away. So we have these fae who spring forward during autumn, which, love it, fantastic. And then that begins the basically countdown towards, okay, you know it is time soon. This thumbs up popped up again. You know that the dark is coming back, which of course brings us to winter. Winter sees the sun set for the last time and not raise for several weeks to months. So, you know, even with the dark being an animate force, there's also just, this is one of those regions, or this is one of those worlds, I guess. This world is like regions in our own world where the sun just does not rise for literally weeks or months because you're in winter. Yeah. Traveling through the night, traveling in winter is definitionally dangerous no matter what time you travel, because the dark spreads everywhere like a blanket across the world, as they say here. Towns find themselves cut off from each other. Islands in the black. We'll talk more about that in a second. But like they said, there's no light. There's monsters everywhere. And what I like about this is the thing that I just called attention to, where they're cut off from each other, these towns. I love a really good points of light setting. And this is a term from 4th edition where it was more metaphorical, right? It was these little pockets of civilization, which are points of light in the darkness. That was the metaphor, where you wouldn't have a series of towns all connected in a consistent, strong way, and it was a little bit more dangerous out there in between the towns. It wasn't like what we're used to in our worlds, right? The wilderness between civilization was a lot more dangerous, and that, even though you can argue that wasn't really the tone of 4th edition, that was the tone of the world they were presenting for you to use adventures like Red Hand of Doom and things like that. This is literally a points of light setting, right? Every civilization in winter is, by definition, a point of light in the darkness. That just really appeals to me as someone who has always loved that term, as someone who got started running games in 4th edition. And again, while I don't think the game is really designed to facilitate that fantasy always got its hooks in me, and I've carried it through when building worlds and designing civilizations, or the lack thereof, in between these civilizations where we have these stretches of dangerous wilderness, which is exactly what this game is promoting. The section about the history is obviously very bare bones, and very deliberately so. So they've made a point to say that all of the, or I should say most, as they say most here, most of the written texts have been destroyed to keep the dark at bay, which is, interesting, because I think that obviously literally means people burned things for light and for heat, presumably. But you can also wonder, this is maybe me teasing out some of my own ideas about what makes the dark interesting. You can kind of wonder, was that a way to sort of appease the dark? Is by sort of destroying their own knowledge? Did people have some reason to believe that would work? Did it work? It's an interesting idea, even though I think they mean it very literally, that, written texts were destroyed because they needed things to burn. I could imagine a civilization that didn't do it just because they had a need for fire, but they also had a fear that perhaps some of that old knowledge may be responsible for the dark. Whether that was founded or not is kind of up to us to decide. So now, because of that, this is a world of oral tradition. So it makes a lot more sense that as you're traveling from town to town, you are going to be communicating with these other towns for the first time in however long, and it's going to really matter. What you're going out and doing is not just going out and helping people, you are keeping these civilizations connected. They made reference to that earlier, but this kind of reinforces that. However, I want to draw your attention to this bit of world building about the past, which I think is really interesting. The history of the world is truly unknown, but most agree on some basic things. First, it is agreed that a long time ago, maybe over 1,000 cycles ago, before the Dark, humanity lived a complicated, but in large parts, comfortable life. The relics of this lost age can still be found. Ancient tools, plastics, and structures can be found in the wastes between towns and the deepest forests. The use of the term plastic is really interesting. First of all, this confirms this is a post-apocalyptic setting, which I think is true of a lot of D&D settings and sort of fantasy role-playing game settings, and we just rarely use that term when we're not describing wastelands like Dark Sun or Mad Max. I think that is because so many of us grew up on the sort of fear of nuclear war and the fear that that is what was going to kill us all, so we just imagined apocalypses as wastelands more often than we did dark forests, which is the case in this world. But this is definitely a post-apocalyptic world. But it also might be our post-apocalyptic world. Granted, there's definitely magic here. Jack Vance wrote about something similar in the Dying Earth book series, which was that, they were so far in the future that, yes, it was a fantasy world, but it was also still our own future in those books. But I just think that's neat and interesting and fun fodder to play with. And you don't have to use that if you don't want to. You can say, oh no, this is this is definitely a post-apocalyptic world. It's just not our apocalypse. Maybe you don't want skyscrapers. Maybe you don't want, or the ruins thereof. Maybe you don't want bunkers or the remains of, suburbs or whatever you don't want to include. That's totally fine. You can just say that in the history of this world, they also happened to develop plastic. Totally fair. I know what I'm probably going to do in my game. But then they talk about how, obviously society collapsed. Some scholars claim weather used to be predictable, not like it is now, where storms rage during summer days and seasons' lengths vary drastically. Again, I have my ideas about how this can connect to our own potential future. But I also again, that's another bit of world building for what this world is like and why travel between different towns is always going to be a little tricky, and why they're not more connected during the summer is storms rage during summer days. This is not going to be a peaceful, sunny day every time you walk off into the wilderness. It is always going to be a challenge of some kind. It just depends on the nature of the challenge that you're dealing with and what you're going out there to do. Are you going out there during the summer to go into a mine and deal with the darkness, the monsters that are lurking in there before the dark comes in the winter and those monsters break free and are free to go and attack? That's a cool adventure, but even just getting there is going to be hard when it's potentially hailing or pouring downpour or tornadoes or something like that. So some interesting bit of world building to help enhance the adventures you're going on, which I think is kind of essential to world building in these games, is to make sure that everything you're doing is in service of enhancing the drama and the danger for the players. Also, again, I want to highlight this paragraph. After the collapse, humanity suffered, food was hard to come by, and tales of violence remain. Whole settlements containing more people than are alive this day were lost in the blink of an eye. The invisible sickness that hangs in some areas is the legacy of these wars. So again, we have a former fallen world where there were whole communities, settlements, cities maybe, full of so many people that there are more people in those settlements that are alive in the whole world now. And everyone there died all at once on some really bad day. And in some of those areas, the invisible sickness still lingers. Again, I think this is nukes. And I think that's neat. And maybe you're going to do something different in your own games. You want to sort of take that and interpret it in a different way. But that's how I'm probably going to play it, because I think that's cool. So again, this is talking about what we were just talking about a second ago. Each town works independently of each other with no central form of governance between them. So it is the exact definition of a points of light setting. Each prepares its own way for the seasons to come. Trade is common between towns, and conflict is not unheard of, but large-scale warfare has been resigned to the past because there's just not enough resources to pull it off, and there's no sort of foundational support structure. There's no king levying taxes because he has no way to enforce it, essentially. And if someone wanted to try, they would have to really overcome some barriers. That might be an interesting narrative to play with in your own games, or it's just a thing of the past that that's not an aspect of this world anymore. And there's no wrong answer there. Walkers find work in the summer months aiding trade caravans, clearing out creatures of the dark who take roost during the winter. That's what I was just talking about. And helping towns prepare for the next time the sun slinks away. Now, these couple pages are about combat. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of it. It's a pretty straightforward system. Basically, the walkers roll to determine what order they're going in, and then you roll just a single die, and that determines after which player you act. And then your monsters go. But you don't roll anything in combat, your players do. So this, again, has a lot more in common with Powered by the Apocalypse systems. So if you attack a character, or one of your monsters does, they themselves have to make a reaction roll. That's what they're doing rather than you making an attack against them. So they can choose to either dodge or parry, or they can attack back, or they can use a different class feature that interacts with an attack in some way. And then that is basically what they're doing when you attack them. That determines whether they take damage or not. If they choose to dodge or parry or use the shield, then if they fail, they're going to take damage. If they succeed, they're not. But if they attack back, they're definitely going to take damage, but they're also choosing to instead attack the monster. So it's not exactly the way it works in a Powered by the Apocalypse system, but it is similar in the sense that the GM is not making these rolls themselves. I think that's interesting. When you reach 0 hit points, you don't die. First, you make a roll in an injury table right away. Then you roll to see if you're going to stay up and keep fighting, or if you fall unconscious. So even if you take you drop to 0 hit points, there's a chance you're still going to be able to keep fighting in combat. I think that is very an interesting and different system. And then, of course, as you take more Darkness Within, you might begin to suffer more effects. And I actually am going to go through all these because I think they're really interesting. 1 through 3, no effect. 4 through 6, Walker begins to show outward signs of darkness within, such as deep bags under their eyes. 7 through 8, Walker's skin begins to lose its hue, their eyes lose their color. When in bright light, they suffer a -1 to all tests, so you're starting to become vulnerable to light. A 9, you start to hear voices calling them into the dark at all times. They'll suffer an additional -1 to all mental tests. They'll make efforts to avoid bright light. And finally, a 10 or higher, you are lost to the dark. They flee into the dark if possible. At this point, no healing or method for removing the darkness within works. They are lost. Every 2 days spent outside of town, you take 1 point of darkness within, so you can't just camp out in the wilderness for 6 days. You have to really find shelter, and soon. And so now we're in the character creation section, but I love that the first question is pick your light source. Where are you from? So part of the character creation process is figuring out. Now, they have some examples here. We were talking about this earlier, how different settlements can have different approaches to light. So they may be, in this case, if you're from the section that has a yew tree covered in glowflies, or if you're from a place that burns bonfires. So the question, what is your light source, is not just a practical one for figuring out how you're navigating through the world. It's also world building. And it is the first question they ask you about your character. That is such a fascinating choice and tells you so much about the priorities of this game and the world that you're playing in. So I believe every settlement we got on that first map has a represented different form of light use here. And of course, if you wanted to invent your own, you would just come up with your own little town and put it on the map somewhere. Forging your own. Across the many seasons, there have been many towns that have been lost. When a town is lost, its name is stricken from the mouths of all who speak, for naming the dead gives power to the dark. But walkers from these towns still exist and carry the town's light with them. New shirt, new day recording, because my filming was interrupted by my kid waking up much earlier than expected from a nap. So I'm actually recording this the next day. We're going to finish up by talking a little bit more about the character options. And so I just want to talk through what classes are available when you play Run from the Dark. Obviously, for most of my audience, you are very familiar with the classes from Dungeons & Dragons, so some of these comparisons are going to connect to that. You have the scholar who goes out there looking for lost knowledge. And they literally say lost knowledge in the places the forests have reclaimed. They're going back out there into the wilderness and looking for knowledge that's been lost. They're the wizards. And I love the scholar. I would really, really want to play one. There's one other class that really appeals to me. We'll talk about that in a second. But the scholar just seems so interesting and inviting to me. Then you have the hunter, which are not just the fighter or the barbarian. They're specifically characters who are good at hunting monsters because they understand the monsters they're tracking down. So they're probably closer, I would say, to a witcher. They're monster hunters specifically. Then you have the shifter, who have these sort of unknown abilities to draw upon the power of beasts. And I do like that they say you don't really know why these things happen. I definitely have my own ideas for how that could be connected to the Fae or things like that. But you can do whatever you want to at your table in terms of why the shifters exist. Then you have the storytellers, and that's sort of the bard analog. They literally talk here about how, storytellers have the ability to reshape the world with their voice alone, which was always something that I've been very critical of the D&D bard about. It's not a fantasy that I've ever really fully understood or really jived with my idea of fantasy is maybe a better way to phrase it. I understand what they're going for, but it's not really part of my idea of what makes fantasy compelling, to have the sort of magic music that sort of taps into the DNA of the universe and hacks it. But I think given that this is a world that is so focused on oral tradition and how your characters have to be these arbiters of stories, traveling from town to town and, conveying stories and being storytellers in that sense, I do think that this sort of bard-esque class, the storyteller, makes a lot of sense in this setting. Certainly, I see the work done to justify it far more than I do with something like D&D. Then you have the hedge witch, and we've heard hedge witches referenced kind of a lot on the pages so far. They are sort of more of an institution in this world, but they are still given respect. They still have some element of awe to them, which I do think is the thing that I'm always missing whenever sort of wizards are part of the fabric of society. And I think part of the reason why I don't feel that same frustration here is because this world is so incredibly decentralized, right? You don't have the sort of Arcana Pensophical with their network where they talk to each other, and the wizards are sort of figuring out how they can better run the world while also serving the governments that are in place. You get the sense that an individual hedge witch would be able to help out a lot with whatever one town is going through, but because all these towns are so disconnected from each other, there's no way for all these hedge witches to band together and run the world, which I do like a lot. Then you have the makers, and makers are really meant to be like inventors, where they are, making potions or making new light sources. I think a good analogy for those would be the artificer, or, if you wanted to go with like the friar from Van Helsing, the one who builds the little light bomb or is making the silver stakes and all those things. That is kind of a good analogy as well, as I'm sure we're all familiar with that film. If you're not, go check out my video about it. Then you have the light carriers, and specifically, they have mastered light. Everyone carries light when they go out into the wilderness. You have to. But they have sort of the ability to heal the wounded. They hold the light deep within themselves. So they're clerics. They're clerics of light, essentially. And that is an idea that Brennan Lee Mulligan has been very critical of during Campaign 4 of Critical Role, because the sort of religion of that world being centered around light is sort of assessed to be a sort of cynical move in that world. But in the world of Run from the Dark, that makes a lot of sense. You absolutely understand why somebody would have quite a bit more reason to praise and value and cherish light, given how they have to keep the dark at bay. And finally, you have the reignited, which are people who were lost to the dark. They wandered away, and they have returned, and the darkness has been purged out of them by the scholars who knew those rituals, and so they have the sort of knowledge of the world that they've encountered so far. And I'm not saying they put this in the book specifically for me. I'm just saying, man, oh man, do I love the Reignited. And if we're continuing the Van Helsing analogy, the Reignited could arguably be what Van Helsing himself was going through, the Maker. That's what the Friar was. And then, of course, Kate Beckinsale's character would be a hunter. I was originally thinking that Van Helsing would be the hunter, obviously, but then you have this weird thing with his forgotten past, when he was like a fallen angel. So I think Reignited is maybe the best analogy you could come up with for a character like that. Because one of the questions I have with the Reignited is, how long ago did they vanish into the dark, right? Was it days ago, weeks ago, months ago, years ago, decades ago? That is such an interesting idea to me, the idea of being a Reignited who has been gone for who knows how long, longer than they would presumably be able to be alive. They've lost all of this time. Everyone they know is gone. It's Captain America. I just want to play Captain America again. I'm a simple man. Now, I'm skipping over a good section of the book here. I'm not talking a lot about the equipment, because obviously that's a major part of this book. What you bring out into the wilderness is going to be extremely important, especially your light source, and there's a lot of stuff about that earlier in the book. But I do want to highlight that every settlement that was mentioned on that map at the beginning of the book is given a full write-up of different elements that you may encounter, people you may deal with, what they trade, what's going on in town. Each one is unique and has its own sort of stuff going on. I really like this. I think they each have a 2-page, or I guess technically 4 pages to each one. And yeah, this is a lot to work with when you're building your own Run from the Dark campaign, because it helps basically invite you to figure out what sort of stuff may be happening for the players. So, for example, this opening page here tells you what's going on here, what sort of dangers are they dealing with, how the town holds back the dark, what is the light source for people who come from here, what do they trade, their food, the different people notes, and then you get the sort of what I would, I guess, call the travel log stuff, where it's like, okay, here's the actual map and where everything is located. And this is the section that you could share with your players, whereas this is the stuff that most of this you'd keep to yourself or reveal to them as you go on. I mean, actually, here, even in this section, they have a watcher's eyes only. So I think they're sort of assuming that a lot of the rest of this you could share with them. You could just tell them what's going on. You may want to just read through and make sure there's no spoilers. But this is the section you would definitely want to hold on to yourself. I'm realizing you can't really see it because it's covered by my camera. But, where they talk about the threat that is going on, or the plot hook here, which means this essentially is a setting guide in the middle of this book. And that is such a cool and useful resource. And especially for a game that is very much not part of an established franchise or an pre-existing IP, they need to make sure that you know how to tell adventures in this world. And the last thing I want to do is just show you some of the monsters that you might deal with in Run from the Dark, just so you can kind of get a sense of the themes of horror of the game. So, for example, we have these sightless wolves. The Hollow Men are like 12-foot tall, man-like structures that basically rarely work together, but there's maybe some rumors that some of them have, and they're completely unperturbed by the darkness. And I just love this art, this imagery of this Hollow Man with the long, long hair, and just so cool and creepy. And I love art like this art of the Vengeful Dead. I love any sort of creature that has a sort of piranha maw. And again, these are creatures who maybe returned from the dark, who were people, and that just makes me so interested in terms of, if you were playing someone who'd come back from the dark, to see yourself compared to these sorts of monsters. I would definitely, if I had someone in my party who used to be in the dark and came back from it, I would definitely use some Vengeful Dead in my game. Here we have the Red Moons, which are the Fae that were mentioned earlier, and just this whole little section of lore about them, and as well as their stat block. Fungus Dead. So if you want to play a Last of Us game, these are definitely something you could drop into this game. Oh man, the way that eye is angled is just so creepy. And then at the end, and I'm not going to show this whole map because I don't want there to be spoilers, but there is a map that has some specific locations where you can find some of these monsters in your games. And I don't know, maybe you would share this with your players and say, okay, you need to know that this is where some of these are located. Or maybe this is more for the game master to kind of get the idea, like, okay, if they go into this region, they should deal with this monster when they're there. And there's a couple of starting adventures, which is very helpful. These are these prompts that basically give you some guidance on how adventures are structured in this game, which I think is incredibly valuable. And an adventure generator here at the end. And then, in case you thought I was off the mark when I talked about the comparisons that I made to modern anxieties, the end of this book literally just talks about climate change in our world and the facts around it and how we can protect ourselves. And actually, as we go through earlier in the book, there's advice for players for survival tips that would actually maybe matter in our world. Like if we go here, your needs should be shelter, water, food, and light, and, waterproof torch, batteries. These are not suggestions that would be for a character in Run from the Dark, but they are things that we need to talk about as we are going to continue to be dealing with the hazards and harrowing nature of climate change. No pun intended. I mean, again, this is a fictional world in this game where the seasons are sort of unpredictable length, but I'm recording this on Tuesday, October 28th, and it is like 89 degrees in Southern California, where typically you would expect it to be not summer anymore. So this book is definitely functioning on my level, and it's doing what I typically do with some of my Critical Role videos, and it's taking all the real-world stressful stuff that people may not want to interface with and putting it at the end. So, if you've gotten this far, you hopefully enjoyed the ride, and now it's time for a little bit of a lesson. By the way, those are coming back in my Critical Role videos coming soon. So yeah, I really, really like this book. I really like what it's going for. I also received, in between recording the first part of this video and recording this part, I received the physical copy that was sent to me. So thank you so much to them. They also came with a couple of little slips, little flyers, as well as cards that I can show my players of the Sightless Wolves. And I don't remember which monster this is. I'm sure I could find it. But these are sort of art pieces I can show to my players as illustrations, which is always very helpful. And the book itself has 2 ribbons, black and white. And I'm not like an expert on books, but it's got, I think, a really cool paper stock. Everything itself looks gorgeous inside the book. And this is really cool, if you take off the book jacket, it can basically function as a GM screen. Because here we have the travel chart, and then we have the map. So you could actually just set this in front of yourself and use it to run the game. I don't think I talked about this in the intro of this video, actually, but this game was created by Will R.D., who is a Welsh game designer who's been working for a long time on other indie games, and this is a really, really cool one. I recommend this. I'm really, really glad that I got my hands on this, and I do think that you would like this if you like this channel and you want something that has some sort of horror themes that is not just trying to force the square peg of horror into the round hole of D&D. So if that's something you're interested in, and I hope that you also understand that this game is also cooking on some levels that I really appreciate. So if you're interested in any of that, check out the link in the description below. Thank you so much to Will R.D. and the team behind Run from the Dark for sponsoring this video. And I have more cool stuff coming very soon, so keep your eyes out for that. And until next time, play fair and have fun.